All right. Well, thank you again for coming this morning to hear the second part of this. I kind of felt like we left it in a, not a bad place, but a chaotic place as we ended last week. We're going to do a quick review so that those of you that were not able to be here can understand what we did. And let me get this down. There we go. We're talking about comfort and hope for the journey of life to death. And we did a lot of talking last week about how the grief part of our lives comes from very different areas. It can be the loss to death of a loved one. It can be the loss of a job, the dissolution of a marriage, anything that leaves that void in our lives. So today we're going to more focus on the loss of a loved one. This logo down here at the bottom, Faith and Grief, a Ministry of Compassion and Connection, is the agency I work with. And that's what we focus on. So we're going to kind of morph into that. But keep in mind that all of these losses, we're talking about feelings, we're talking about things, tools that might help as you go through a time of loss. All of these things can be applicable to any loss. And as I said, it doesn't have to be the loss of a loved one. Okay. Aha, yay. We talked last week about the healing power of story, our own story. And it's not something necessarily that has to start, well, I was born in blah, blah, blah. It's just where you are and your remembrances of something most recently or something a long time ago. The healing power of story. We each have a story to tell. It's unique and filled with just who we are. Sometimes we think our story isn't there. But when we stop and begin to look around at others in our story, at the circumstances where we find ourselves, and as we view ourselves, the story comes into focus. But our story today is not our story tomorrow. Each day we move forward. It's an interesting thing to think of your life and today, this morning, where each of us is in our story. That thing about my story today is not my story tomorrow, because whatever happens this afternoon gets added. And that, for me, kind of helps as I go through struggles, as I go through times when things aren't going as, well, mainly things aren't going as I planned. And but it does help me to realize that life is a constant. Life is, and as long as we're here, life goes on, whether it's what we planned or not. So that's our story. That's where we started last week. How does grief affect us? We talked about this last week. It affects us physically. We kind of noted that when one of these voids happens, no matter what it is that the loss is, there's a physical reaction. We talked about stress. We talked about being tired. Interestingly enough, with a significant loss, many times we'll find ourselves ill. We'll get a cold. We'll get a sinus infection. Our body reacts to what we're feeling. Grief also obviously affects us emotionally. All of those memories, if it's the loss of a loved one, all of those things that got left on my desk when I was laid off, all of that, there's an emotional reaction to that. Social, the grief affects us socially, particularly in the loss of someone we love, and it could be a spouse. Your whole world is changed socially. The people that you were social with before are still there and they're still present, but many times that that relationship has changed because you're no longer a couple, you're a single at this point. And that changes the social atmosphere of the relationships. And then we also talked about spiritual. Grief changes us spiritually. Grief challenges us spiritually. God, why did I lose my job? God, why did my mother have to die at 35? All those questions about our spiritual understanding of our life. So those were some of the things we talked more in depth about last week. What do we experience at the loss of something or someone in our lives? These were the graphs. We had a bunch of graphs that we looked at last week. We looked at a graph for shock and numbness. You know, when does that happen? How intense is it? Well, obviously, if you think about it, shock and numbness is intense at the very beginning as the loss happens, and the duration, it decreases somewhat over, let's say, 24 months. We were looking at a study done in a hospital over a 24-month period. That doesn't mean that all these things are over after 24 months. That was just the study. But the graph for this one was very intense, very high at the beginning, and then decreased over the months until you got to 12 months. And then it shot back up and then decreased as we got to the 24 months. The same with disorientation, very intense at the beginning, decreased somewhat, not quite as much as the shock and numbness, but decreased somewhat the first 12 months and then shot back up. And sometimes the disorientation at 12 months is kind of a surprise. You think, well, what's happening here? I know that this is the 12-month anniversary of, let's say, my loved one's death. But I've been dealing with this for 12 months. What's happening? So it's a reaction to the grief over the first 12 months, and then it also decreased as we got to 24 months. Searching and yearning for the loved one, or for the memories, or for the things you used to do with that loved one, wasn't quite as intense at the very beginning. We looked at the graph and it wasn't as intense as the first two, but as we went through those first 3 months, it started to go up. It also decreased until you got to 12 months, and then it shot up. So all these first three were just all around at the 12th month anniversary. And then there's reorganization. We talked about this one. Doesn't come, it's there at the very beginning as the death happens, but the reorganization really begins as you get into those first, say, 6 months, and then keeps going up. This is the only one, the four that we looked at last week, that ends up being very, very intense at the end of 24 months. If you'll think of it, you've had time to wrestle with the loss, and the reorganization is kind of the moving forward, the living on of your life without the person that you've lost. The intensity and duration of these feelings vary, obviously, over the first 2 years, and they still vary beyond that. As I said, the study we were looking at was only for 24 months, but these four things come probably for the rest of your life as you remember the one that you've lost. We took those four graphs and overlaid them, and this is what it ended up looking like. it was a mess. So this is grief, chaotic and unpredictable. And that's where we ended the class last week. That's why I said I kind of left the class in a chaotic state. But all of these you can see, just to recap what I've already said, the intensity here going down, this is 4 months, 6 months, they all come together again at 12. The three that you would want to have decrease do at the end of the 24 months. And this is the green one is the reorganization. So that's in a nutshell in 3 minutes or 5 minutes, what we did last week. Yeah.
Some of you know Jared Warren, so he shared something with me that was really helpful as far as dealing with trauma. That he said he viewed it as, imagine you have a stack of index cards, and it's everything you are and everything you have is a stack of index cards, and somebody comes along and throws a shoulder into you and your index cards go flying in the wind. Mm-hmm. And then you spend a period of time figuring out whether you even want any index cards. Mm-hmm. And then gradually you start picking one up at a time. Mm-hmm. And say, is this right? And then, you put some back down. Mm-hmm. And then gradually, eventually over time. So that kind of makes me think about, the beginning of that was, when you get hit, it's like, you don't even know where you're going from there. Mm-hmm. And then the reorganization kind of comes later, where you start figuring out, well, who am I and what I want to do? And you can't even begin to answer that question at the beginning of that.
Yeah. So I love that. I love that image. And maybe to carry that image a little farther, it gives you a chance, not in the beginning, but as you go through that struggle of grief, gives you a chance to decide which card you want to pick up ever, not at what order. But anyway, yeah. That's just tell Jared thank you. Yeah. Even I appreciated that image. So this is where we were in chaos, and over the first 24 months. Grief comes in different circumstances. Anticipatory grief, grief before death or loss. Sometimes that happens and you recognize it, and sometimes life is just so intense that you got to get through this one day, and I'm not looking at the big picture, so I'm just deciding today I'm going to get through this one day. As probably sometimes anticipatory grief becomes a thing after the death and after you're thinking back over the 2 years before your loved one died. Anticipatory grief, if recognized, the recognition of it is really helpful. That this is what I'm going through. This is what is happening. It could be a diagnosis that it is known to be life-ending. You don't know the timing, and the medical science can tell us 3 months or 3 years or whatever, but we don't really know. And so the anticipatory grief is helpful when it's recognized. Acute grief is the loss is recent or it's just happened. So it's upfront. It's your whole world at that moment and during those days. We've had an interesting phenomenon happen with the pandemic that we've seen at Faith and Grief, because we were not able to hold memorial services and all the mostly religious traditions that we have in our culture. Those have had to be put off. And the acute kind of grief has kind of been spread out. It's a longer time period. If you look at the Christian faith, typically it's the memorial service was within 7 to 10 days, if not sooner than that. And we haven't been able to do that. And so that's been a struggle for not just the ones in the immediate family, but the friends and the colleagues. And, when's the service going to be? Well, we can't do that because we can't all get together except on Zoom. And so it's been an interesting and part of the struggle of the pandemic that has brought to us that. But acute grief is right when the loss happens. Early grief, probably the first couple of years. It's during that time that here again, you're trying to decide, who am I without the person I've lost? I used to be Sally's mother, but Sally's gone. And so now, who am I? I took my identity from my daughter and all her activities and the things we did together. And so the early grief, probably a couple of years. Everybody has early grief at a different intensity as well as a different time period. And then the last one is the mature grief, and that's truly the rest of our lives. As the intensity certainly over the years declines, but it's never gone. And that is tough for us to handle. That the grief, we think, let's get over it. Let's move forward. Some people say, let's move on. To me, moving on is like, okay, I've done that. Now I'm going to check it off the list. We talked about this last week. But to move forward takes the grief with you. It's just in a different form and a different intensity. And that's certainly possible and probably healthier than marking it off. So we've looked at 4 different kinds of grief. And grief obviously is touched with all kinds of feelings. I chose these 4 and then the descriptors underneath them just as general things, general feelings that we all have. If you look at MAD, think about this past week. What happened to you, whatever, this past week. And under MAD, do any of these crop up in a feeling that you had? Angry, irritated, bitter, resentful, infuriated, boiling, fuming, enraged, or incensed? I hope you didn't mentally circle many of those, but we have those weeks. Let's look at sad. Any of these hit this past week for you? Disappointed, alone, empty, fatigued, useless, miserable, guilty, disillusioned, and discouraged. Let's look at scared. This past week, did you find yourself scared? And I would also add in fear. Many of the emotions that we experience individually come out of fear, and we don't recognize them because we just don't think, we think it's something else. We give it a name, and that's good. But the bottom line underneath that is I'm scared or I'm afraid. So under scared, paralyzed, dominated, lost, forced, uneasy, skeptical, doubtful, anxious, or helpless. As I said before, I hope that your week that you're thinking of this past week did not include many of these from this first 3 lists. The last list is glad. So hopefully you'll see some positiveness in your past week as well. Delighted, eager, relieved, joyous, elated, optimistic, thrilled, encouraged, content. And I'm going to add, because of the name of this course, comforted or hopeful. We all have feelings. We come with feelings to different circumstances. Recognizing them is the main part, that is the healthy part of talking about feelings. Ellen.
You know, in the pandemic and with acute, well, maybe even, what was the first one? Anticipatory, you know, anticipatory, acute, early and mature. It seems like we're in the mature grief about the pandemic, about what our world is, about the fragility of humanity, about how we don't play together well in the sandbox, you know. I mean, there's a lot, if you look at those first three columns and you think about the last 2 years,
Yeah.
just with the grief around the pandemic. And then if you have other losses, you know, man, it's a lot to carry. And, you know, you mentioned how the pandemic affected our grieving. The acute time was extended, you know, but wow, whoo, because it's compounded with other feelings around the pandemic. So I think it's really good to know about, you know, grief and what our grief has been around the pandemic. I think that's good thinking. And then to add anyone who was lost. The other thing I thought was in that confusion graph of 2 years, man, if you have another loss in the midst of that, that throws that whole thing.
Absolutely.
It's like on steroids. Yeah. And so, woo, man, no wonder we're tired.
Yeah, well, last week, one of the things I read was that grief is exhausting. And it is exhausting physically, mentally, emotionally, all around. Tim?
I have a couple more comments on for MAD. You need to add reactionary
Okay.
because you get upset and then your friends you mistreat. You do all kinds of things that you shouldn't do. So that's another one. And then another one could be what I would call double grief. And it doesn't mean you're twice as grieving, but you're grieving about having such intense grief. And that creates a different perspective of it. So anyway.
There are so many dimensions to this time period in our lives that is not, and I say time period, that sounds like it's going to be over. I just said it's not. It's going to change, but it's not going to be over, Harry.
So I think it's a standard therapist question that, you know, you go in and they say, well, what would make you happy? And so I remember laughing and saying, it's like, I can't even think about that. So, I mean, to me, it was like the first three are what you start with, and then you're eventually one day working toward the fourth column of glad. But I don't know, my observation was can't even think about glad until you get to a certain point.
But looking at this, at least you know the glad is out there. You may not feel it for a long time, but at least the glad is out there. And yes, this is not an exhaustive list of all the names of different emotions. It's just to get us thinking about let me see what the next one is. I'm going to use the agency that I am involved with as an example. There are a number of groups, agencies, programs within churches who deal with grief. And ours just happens to be just one of them. And, but I thought, you know, I'm immersed in this and I'll use this as the example. We begin each of our gatherings, and we have gatherings that meet once a month for an hour, some in the morning, most of them at noontime, some in the evening. We begin that with a statement of purpose. Grief is a process which will not end today. The hope is to create a safe haven for you in the midst of your grief, a place to remember, a place to name your loved one if you like, a place to sit and listen, a place among others who have suffered loss, a place in the hands of God. We're going to see a short video here. Back, I don't know, late 2020, when the pandemic happened and everybody was staying home, obviously people aren't getting together for a grief support luncheon. And so we, as well as everybody else, went to Zoom. And so I have a video of one of our speakers that we're going to listen to. At Faith and Grief luncheons, Faith and Grief gatherings, because they're not always at lunch, we do start with that statement of purpose. And then we have a speaker who maybe 5 or 7 minutes talks about their story. And that's all it is. It's not a, this is how I did it and this is how you ought to do it too. It's just their story. Hannah Buchanan was one of our speakers, and she was, I don't remember what it was, but she couldn't be on Zoom directly, so she videoed herself and sent it to me, and that's how we had our speaker that month. So I have Hannah's story. And so we're going to hear Hannah's story. As you listen, think about those 4 columns of emotions and the names of emotions. See if there are any of those that jump out to you from what Hannah is talking about. And then we'll have a time to debrief over her story after we see it. It's only 5 minutes, so it's not very long. Let's start it and we'll check the sound, see if you can hear. Her voice is rather soft. So if we need to up the volume and then start it again, we'll do that. But let's hear what Anna, oh, one other thing. She says at the very beginning, she's a pastor at Highland Park Methodist, and she refers to Bob Nelson, Dr. Bob Nelson. Bob is, or was, he's retired, a psychology teacher for many years at J.J. Pierce. And really neat guy, just I have really enjoyed working with him. He's on the leadership team for our Richardson Faith and Grief group that puts these things on in Richardson. And so I just want to tell you that's who she's referring to. So let's see if we can hear her. Of course, we had her on earlier to check the sound. There we go.
Well, hey, good afternoon. My name is Hannah Buchanan. I am one of the pastors on staff at Highland Park United Methodist Church, but long before I got here. Well, hey, good afternoon. My name is Hannah Buchanan. I am one of the pastors on staff at Highland Park United. Well, hey, good afternoon. My name is Hannah Buchanan. I am one of the pastors on staff at Highland Park United Methodist Church, but long before I got here, I was a student in Dr. Bob Nelson's class at J.J. Pierce High School back in 2005. So it's really a privilege to be asked to share my story with you today, especially by one of my favorite teachers. Well, whoever knows how to start their story of grief. I came from a family that was, I thought, vibrant, whole, intact. And the semester after my sophomore year of college, things just sort of fell apart. My dad was a psychologist. He was a family marriage psychologist, and he was an elder at our church growing up here in Dallas. But had battled depression and some bipolar throughout his life. It wasn't something we talked about much when we were kids. I don't know if I really had a framework for understanding it, but we lost him to suicide in May of 2008. I had just finished my sophomore year at Wheaton College up in Chicago. And really, it rocked everything I thought about the world, about the kinds of people who take their own lives and the kinds of families that happens to. For those of you who are watching who have survived suicide, there is a sharp stigma about, as I mentioned, what kind of people kill themselves and what kind of families this happens to. And mine just didn't fit the stereotype I had. So I had some identity issues to wrestle with. But I think the question I've been posed is, how did my faith help me navigate that storm? I was so blessed to be in a context where really mature believers held space for me to doubt and to be angry and to wrestle. I was not around people who offered silly statements like everything happens for a reason, or there's one more angel in heaven, the dumb things people say because they don't know how to sit still in grief. It's a lonely place to grieve. But I had one professor in particular. I was in his office hours and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life after I graduated. And he said to me, "Do you realize you've just been hit by a Mack truck? And it's okay to lay on the ground for a while." And that really gave me permission to be where I was and to not judge where I was. In other words, to be sad, to be angry, to be numb. I guess all of the phases of grief people encourage you to work through. He also gave me permission to be angry with God. And I would say that for me, the most important part about my spiritual life in that season was that I was engaged with God, even if I was angry, or I was engaged with God and not just turning my back in silence. I actually, if I go back and read through my journals, I really did experience God as with me in my grief. And I don't know how to explain that. And I don't know that I would say from a pulpit to people who are hurting, to a room full of people who are hurting, that you should be okay because God is with you. But I really do believe this. I believe we see it in Scripture over and over, that all the way to the cross, God is not afraid of suffering. God himself suffers, has suffered. And even in his name, Emmanuel, God with us, that God enters the mess of humanity and endures the mess and the evil that we put out into the world and that we suffer. I've been reading in the last few months the story of Joseph in Genesis all over again. And it is not lost on me that over and over and over in the story of Joseph in prison, he's been sold by his brothers into slavery. He's been wrongly accused of assault and thrown into prison. And in 6 verses, like 8 times, we're told that God was with Joseph. And I just cling on to that in my own story of grief, and I can see it in hindsight. But to know that God is with me right where I am. He's not pushing me out of that. He's giving me space and permission, and that he's big enough to handle any feeling I might put at his feet, as long as I'm still coming to his feet. So my hope for you in your own journey of grief, in your own story of suffering, because they're all unique, is that you would sense the nearness of God, that you would sense the tenderness of God, and that you would be able to trust in the mystery that he is with you in the darkness, and that you will see light again. Thanks for having me today, and blessings on you and your journey.
So what did you hear? Sorry?
I heard your list.
Heard my list? Yeah. What were Hannah's feelings that she shared or that you heard through her story that she shared?
The one she said was, it was okay to be angry with God.
Mhm.
Huh? Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
But I have a friend that recently lost his wife. And I think he's at a point where he's a little angry.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think also she had an additional stigma with the suicide component.
Yeah.
In addition to all the other phases of grief, I think hers was a questioning
Mhm.
as well.
Mhm.
Did she say it was her father?
Yes. Yeah.
I think another thing you heard was the gift of a lifelong journey with God. It didn't just start, I don't think, when her father died. It was there before, and she was able to
Mhm.
continue. And anyway, yeah.
And there was some sense of a faith before the loss. Mhm.
I think I loved it when she talked that her professor basically said, "You've been hit by a Mack truck.
Mhm.
Fall on the ground if you want. Go with the grief. Don't, because
Yeah.
I experienced when I lost my dad, I just went into robot mode.
Mhm.
And by not processing, that lack of process bit me in the patootie 6 months later, so you've got to give yourself that time. And it's sometimes great when a friend does say, you've got to go through this,
Mhm.
give yourself permission to go through this. So.
Now, that's a huge one. You've been hit by a Mack truck. Well, duh, I've lost somebody very close to me. The second part is the important part. Lay there a while. Give yourself permission, as you said, to grieve, to get a handle, if you can, on what's happened. Rocky, who's got yeah.
I think when I lost my brother to suicide, I think you tend to worry about everybody else.
Mhm.
You forget about yourself. And that delays everything. Like,
Mhm.
so, a year later, you might get hit by it.
Yeah.
So it's very, very strange how that works.
Mhm. And you and Hal are both correct that the method of death, the suicide, does add another layer to the grief process, and to it just does. Ellen?
I just love that you're making us name our feelings or look at our feelings, because that's one of the hardest things. And to lay on the ground after being hit by a Mack truck, and I think it's really important that we don't judge ourselves when this happens as to how we respond, because it's really sort of just survival, and it's all okay, and it's all part of it. Ultimately, to be willing to try to name our feelings
Mhm.
is a huge part, I think, because then you can start just owning where you are and owning the, that it all has just hit the fan. I mean, how do you describe hitting the fan? Well, there's on this blade and there's on this blade. I mean, it's like, and it feels horrible and yucky. And so I think that I love that you're inviting us to name our feelings. That's a really hard thing to do. And even I'm noticing you said, what did she feel? We can't even name what she felt. I mean, even though she named it, we skirt away from that. You know, yeah. Feelings are hard.
At one point, and I don't know where this little cartoon is, but at one point in my career, I worked for a number of years in a hospital with oncology patients and their families. And one of the little cartoons that I had that I used as we talked about issues such as this was a great big hairy ball, kind of a scary looking thing. It wasn't a person. And then the next little frame said something about, oh, well, that's my fear. And the third frame then was this big hairy thing down to about that big. And it always made me comforted to know if I name an emotion, I don't have control of it. It's still there, but it's not quite as big and scary. And I guess that's why I keep going back to name your emotion, name what you're feeling. Knowing, again, it's not going to go away. The issue, the struggle, whatever it is still there. But it's not as big. It's not as, it's kind of like, you know, you had the test on Friday and you don't get the results until Wednesday of the next week. And it may turn out to be a significant diagnosis, but at least you know the name, you know what's happening. It decreases the intensity, the power. Thank you. That's the word I'm looking for, of what's happening. So, anything else that you want to share that you heard? Janet, oh, got one over here.
I guess one thing she did that I've never done is she journaled. So you heard her say, when I looked back at my journals, and I guess I'm going to keep that for future reference.
Any other comments?
It helps a lot to figure out that life is temporary. Everything about life is temporary. Everything will change. It's just a great big patchwork quilt. And it's nice to remember some of the patches sometimes.
I like the image of the patchwork quilt because that makes me think of comfort. That the quilt, you know, I'm cold, so I put a quilt around me. And I'm into images this morning, I guess.
That was made out of all my cousins and my dresses from long ago.
Yeah.
That was the thing with grandmothers. They saved all the fabric pieces.
You all probably know Diane Pennington. I know she spoke a couple of weeks ago as the Sunday school leader. Diane will take, and she has made a number of these, when the husband died and the wife brought in all later, you know, a year later, brought in all his ties. You know, I don't see a tie in this room. So you all have a bunch of them in your closet, but the wife brought in the ties and Diane wove them together and made us a pillow of all the ties. And so, you know, what a remembrance for her and for the family. Oh, I remember that was Dad's Christmas tie. And that was, you know, so there are lots of ways to remember the ones we've lost. And Janet, thank you for the segue because the last thing I wanted to share with you, and let's see, got 7 minutes. That clock is slow. Just share with you, we're not going to do any of them, but what do you do with all this? What can help? Some of the tools that are out there, and there are many, and one of them is journaling. Writing your story. It doesn't have to be, or again, it doesn't have to be from beginning to end. I have a friend right now who is filling out a book about his life and for his grandchildren to know, what his childhood was like. I have 2 of those books that I've been given by my grandchildren, and they're still not filled out. So I've got that ahead of me. But journaling can be as much as sitting down at your computer and just for 10 minutes, just phrases, just type as fast as you can. There doesn't have to be a beginning. There doesn't have to be an end. Just get it down. Living through those memories for yourself. What is my story? I have another friend who's reading her mother's journals. And what a blessing that her mom for years and years sat down and did the journaling that she is now able to read. I just think being able to understand somebody else after they've died is such a gift. I wish my mom had done the same, and I'm also wishing I had done the same for my granddaughters. But so journaling is an important part, an important tool to use to get those feelings down on paper, on your computer screen. Mostly it's just for you. If you write, and you think that felt good, but I'm not going to share it with anybody, throw the paper away, delete your document, whatever, however you've done it. But the times that I have journaled, it has been very beneficial. Another tool that we can use, and here Diane Pennington comes to mind because Diane uses this a lot, and she may have used it when she was the speaker as well, is a breath prayer. And breath prayer is sitting very quietly. Obviously, you're breathing. When Paul writes to pray continually, to pray incessantly, if you link that to your breath, you're breathing all the time. And if you think of a phrase that is meaningful to you on your inhale and on your exhale, it can be the petition, or inhale could be Lord Jesus, and the exhale could be hear my prayers. Lord Jesus, help me with this situation. And if you do that for just 3 minutes, one thing is it calms your body down, your physical body down, but focus on your prayer and then put a phrase to the inhale and the exhale. Those are just a couple of things. One of them, has anybody, what time is it? It's not time to continue that thought I had. Any other comments about grief? There's so much. Faith in Grief, the agency I work with, does these hour-long gatherings all over the city once a month. They also have 8-week grief workshops that are more in depth into grief and how you're struggling with whatever has happened in your life. There's podcasts. We have retreats down at Mo Ranch, at Camp Gilmont in East Texas, at Montreat in North Carolina. We've got one coming up where Chris Lee just was at retreat he was doing. So there's all kinds of things out there, and that's just one agency. There's all kinds of hospice companies typically have a grief program. So if you're looking for one, if you're have someone in your family or know someone who is struggling, there's help out there. And so I would encourage you to look for it and take advantage of it. A lot of things are online these days. And as I said, our gatherings once a month are online as well as in person, the workshops, all those things I mentioned. I brought some brochures and things if you want to pick them up as you leave about Faith and Grief. Canyon Creek is a host of Faith and Grief, and we will be hosting the 1-hour gatherings in October, November, and December here at Canyon Creek. This month and September, they're down at Arapahoe United Methodist. And then First Methodist Richardson is also one of our hosts in our little group. So, you know, we're there if and when you feel the need. I'm going to close with a blessing. That is, whoops, right there. Unless anybody has another comment or question, let's close with this blessing. May the sweet light of change shine in your darkness. May the first breath of each morning help you begin life again. May the memories unfold as prayers for life. May the love continue to fill the silence. Amen, and go in peace. Thank you. What? Oh, well, just a minute. Let's see. It's not on my screen anymore because I was mirroring what was there. Catherine, ask her if she can put it back up. Take a picture. You're welcome. Thank you, Nancy, for being here. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. And happy anniversary. Very good. Very good. I don't know why Kathy thinks she shouldn't share that. She always says, I'm not supposed to say this, but. You only have an anniversary once a year.